Now, in this demonstration, we'll see how to get started with creating and using stored procedures in MySQL. You may also hear the term stored programs, but you can see here in the navigator, they are known as stored procedures, but programs is fine. And for this example, I'm just using this very simple, very small table of category from the Sequila database. You can see there are only 3 columns and only 16 rows. So it's just nice and quick and simple. But in terms of a stored procedure itself and what it's all about, it really is just reusable, executable code. And that sounds similar to a view, and it is because a view is just a saved SQL statement, and it is reusable, but a view does not have the ability to accept parameters. Procedures do. In other words, I can create a view that simply says select star from category, and I could pass in a piece of criteria. In other words, I could say where category ID equals 1, but that would be hard-coded right into the view. So every time I execute the view, I would only ever see category 1. If I want to change it to something else, I have to manually edit the code of the view and then save it and re-execute. So it's not particularly flexible. With a stored procedure, you can pass in a variable value so that every time you execute the procedure, you can in fact see different results. That's what's known as the parameter. So that's what's happening right here. I'm passing in a category ID, which is an integer, that's the data type, and I can pass in a different one each time and get different results without having to change the code of the procedure itself. All right, now we'll see that in action in a moment. But one other thing to point out is this delimiter line here. And this is just a bit of a syntax issue because in MySQL by default, the delimiter is this character here, the semicolon, which essentially just marks the end of a statement so that MySQL knows that if you have several statements to execute, this is the separator. But when you create procedures, you don't use the keyword of as to define the code like we did with views. You use begin. Every begin statement must have an end statement. So we are essentially saying, well, here's the end of a statement, and here's the end of a statement. So we're telling MySQL how to distinguish those two from each other. Okay? That's what this is doing. The delimiter just temporarily says, here's a different delimiter so that you can distinguish this end from that end. Because not only is it the word end to close off the begin, it is the end of the statement as well. And as mentioned, it is just temporary. So if I were to just close this entire script, for example, it would reset itself. I'm just resetting it here because I have more code to execute later. Okay, so this just sets it back to its default. So we set a new delimiter. We create the procedure. This is simply its name, get category, and then in parentheses, the value that will be passed in as the parameter, and it does need a data type, and it has to match what is going in to the actual table. So let's look at the table itself. There's category, there are the columns. Category ID is an integer, okay? Tiny int, but integer is compatible with that. Then the begin marks the actual statement, which in this case is select star from category, but look at the criteria, where category ID equals whatever is passed in to the value of the parameter, not a static value. Then we see the semicolon and then our end. Okay, so we can execute this and this won't return any records. It will simply create the procedure. So let's go ahead and execute. Let's reset the delimiter. Now to call that, you can see the keyword is call, name of procedure, and then this is the parameter that will be passed in. So this will essentially equate to where category ID equals 1. Let's execute. And there it is. But now you can see the flexibility because I can change this to anything else. 5, re-execute. and I get a different record back. So that essentially distinguishes a view from a stored procedure. Now, that's a fairly simple example. Again, you can have multiple input parameters, and you can create some fairly complex strings. For example, I could say where the category ID is between parameter 1 and parameter 2, and I'd see multiple records come back. But for the time being, this does illustrate how you can gain a little more flexibility by using procedures. Now, here's another quick example where we insert a record instead of just retrieving one. Same delimiter declaration here. Same syntax, create procedure, but this one's called new category. And it's going to accept a category name as a varchar. Okay, and again, that matches the data type of the original table. And in this case, my code is to insert into the name and last update columns. We can leave the ID blank because it's an auto increment. Then the values that are going in are the values of the parameters. So whatever is passed in for category name. And then note for the last update column, I can use this now function to simply insert the current date and time. Okay, now includes both date and time. Then I just reset the delimiter again, and then we can execute. So let's create the procedure. Then we can just reset the delimiter. And now to call it, you can see I'm passing in a value of educational as the name. And again, I can leave the last update blank because the function is inserting the value, and I can leave the ID blank because it's an auto increment. So I need only pass in the name of the category. And now let's select all values, and we should see our new record. And there it is. Okay. So again, when defining procedures, determine which parameters are going to be used for the procedure, and then just make sure that you treat the syntax correctly with the delimiters, and ensure that when users call the procedures, they are passing in appropriate values for the parameters. And that's how you can get started with stored procedures in MySQL.